It's so good to see you. How have you been, Simon? What have you been up to?
Been pretty good.
Oh,
Pretty
great.
good. Yeah. Well, what I've been up to, so much stuff happens. I've been
No.
up to, let's say, more stuff on the sort of shamanic path, experimenting with some different methods of getting people together and doing some
Oh,
journeying. So that's been super interesting and very rewarding. So that's great.
wow.
Yeah.
No,
Playing around with the sort of style of uh, ceremonialism. So,
mm. Well, that is delightful. And Jockin and Dimitri, it's good to see you. And Simon here is awesome. I've spoken to him as Voicecraft. He's had some tremendous conversations with Cadell and Tim Adlin, and we hang out at Voicecraft quite a lot. And I've been obviously working on the map is indestructible. I'm more and more interested. People are talking about the World War II consensus being at an end, and I'm curious what people mean by that. What exactly is the World War II consensus? I'm also very interesting when you're talking about gathering people, the rituals of gathering to people, experimenting and with people. Christian was speaking about that last week, which I think is very interesting. I'd be curious if you don't mind to say more on that, Simon, like how you've been working and experimenting with gathering people and that.
yeah, will do. No, yeah, gathering. So I've been working with using. So I'm a shamanic practitioner for Daniel and Thomas. And one of the main methods I use for journeying is actually voice, and less so singing, chanting, or drumming, but more like guided meditation. And I vocalize whatever territory I'm traveling into. I vocalize what I see, but it feels, when I'm really in tune, it feels more of a channeling. So I'm just broadcasting some sort of field, and if people are synchronized with their attention, usually I sync them with a guided meditation based on the physical body or the experience of having a body. Then when they are synchronized, just yesterday we journeyed to shape shift or melt fields with whales, with these large ocean mammals. And we did this with a group of like 6 people. And I managed to guide people to connect very deeply to that field and then have them just journey down into the depths with a whale and coming back up with very changed perspective and embodied feelings around how they experience themselves and interesting messages. And the more and more I do this, the more and more I become aware that it's actually an embodiment practice. Because what I'm doing is I'm having people first embody their own body very clearly with a sort of Vipassana style body scan. Then I sort of guide them into becoming embodied as a group, embodying with me in a sense and with the group. And then I sort of drop their field into larger fields. So we also did this with the earth. So having people meld with the earth's core and then seeing what they experience. And so it's a shape shifting. So I'm practicing doing shape shifting experiments with people as ceremony. So that's kind of what I'm doing. And I noticed that most of my how you say, with the clients I work with, most of the problems that people experience are embodiment problems. And so this is one way how I'm working with that. So getting people to embody themselves and larger fields. So
Well, that is delightful. And wherever Seth is, a body that moves, he was just excited, and he was here at the house showing some of the work that he's done with musicality, and Dimitri has been teaching on Dall-E and the voice. And I think, one of the things, and I'll give it to Jockin and Daniel, is, in the map is indestructible. One of the things that we're kind of exploring is the idea of the possibility of consensus through rational inquiry and bringing people together in community based on, say, worldview or shared premises. And part of the issue is ultimately the argument is going to be that when rationality seeks to create what I call an internally consistent system. And once it does it by assuming certain axioms that cannot be falsified, they're what make rationality possible. And the problem becomes is how do you then determine which axioms to accept or not, right? You have to do it, what I like to say, non-rationally, which is going to be in the realm of, say, embodiment or emotion, or I'll make a distinction between perception and thinking, as Aspasi and Seth and I were just talking about. But here's the issue. People can reach different first premises or axioms according to different non-rational variables, of which then organize their rationality. And once that occurs, how do you get people then, say, in globalism or difference to interact? Because they're trapped in their crystalline rational structure, right? This has major political, social, global ramifications because if people are all in their what I'll just call a map, and I make a distinction between a map and a notion. A notion entails an essential contradiction, a map does not. But the problem is that, and I'm thinking of Alfred Korbowski, who is the one who created the phrase, the map is not the territory. And he wrote a book called The Science of Sanity, which I think is a hidden gem. And he means a whole lot more than just that phrase. He's really tying, he actually is warning that thinking in terms of identification versus situation or movement or flow leads to mental illness and a loss of sanity because there is no stable states in nature. And so when he's saying the map is not the territory, what he's trying to warn is that if everyone just lives according to a map, actually it's going to lead to madness and dysfunction and different things, right? But then, so he's not saying, oh, the map is not the territory and we're stuck in maps. He's like, we have to have a flexible relationship with maps. And also map making is part of the territory, right? So, you know, it's an interesting, but here's the point. If maps are created by different people according to different underlying premises, and then they create crystalline structures. On what basis then can you have true diverse interaction? On what basis then can people get across? Well, it's going to be things like embodiment. It's going to be things like field. It's going to be things like emotions. It's going to be things like different practices. Mr. Jockin is a master on the topic of beauty. It's going to be on topics of the strike of beauty or something that Javier, Michelle, and Jockin have been talking about called geopatia. We have to think that. Or pluralism will simply be people stuck in their crystalline rational structures, constantly fighting with one another. And I'm fascinated on what you're saying with embodiment processes, with shape shifting. That is fascinating, and I appreciate you sharing that. I'll give it to Jock.
No, Simon, I like your comments really, really well because I'm working on a course on health right now. And, you know, when you read Aristotle's account of health in the body, it very much is the question of the field. What exactly is the demarcation of body and the substance for Aristotle? It is not so clean cut. There are many ways to angle this. One aspect is the fact that in Nicomachean Ethics is a whole book, section of a book meditating on the happiness of a person is not dependent on the individual unit. It's also his ancestors and his children. Now, in that directionality, so we have now the field of what is your actuality of eudaimonia is not the individual subject. It's other people. It's in a generational genealogical timeline of past and future, let alone in politics, the point of the polis before the individual. Whoops. In the same model of the actuality is prior to the potential from Aristotle. So it's using that same line of argumentation. So now the polis is what gives reality to the individual. So we have that directionality, let alone the genealogy one. We have that aspect. Another big one is this term called enkontos. We're going to talk about that in the health course. So it means development. So the idea is that obviously an entity as an embryo, as a toddler, as a teenager, as an adult, as an elderly person, this is the same thing, the same entity, yet it's not the same thing. The morphe, the form of it, as a morphetic object is clearly different. The bones are different, the organ disposition, the arrangement is completely different. Yet it is still a man, right? And this particular person. So the eidos, and actually the encantos actually has within this root echo. So I play on this in the course. I talk about this is basically you can almost consider for Aristotle what is a body. It's a kind of echo between the morphetic form of this particular moment and an atemporal eidos, kind of echoing off each other, reverbing off each other. So again, it gives a sense of almost like the boundary line is much more fuzzy in terms of a body. So I'm resonating with what you're saying, Simon, on that note. Another actually same form, source origin form of encantos, right? It's echo. Um, there's another aspect of it too, in the sense that it's also used for the word in Plato's greater Hippias for excess. Hyper, it's hyper echoes, encons. So it's the same, it's basically this hyper echo, this kind of a greater or abounding reverberation. That's what excess is, what Plato's talking about. Um, and that all kind of closes in because of the big part of what Aristotle says. I'm bringing this up in the sense that actually this is very. I heard architects say this too. Beauty in architecture is very much about place. The place of things matter immensely for Aristotle in the sense that health is in a body, in a place. And even though actually it's very fun, this kind of it's and then in the particulars about again, we'll talk more about this in the course. The word for kind of disposition of a kind of body in a certain arrangement is called diathesis, through thesis. It's like this kind of idea that I think we think of our thought as independent of body for Aristotle is not necessarily the case. It's much more nuanced than that, let alone topic, topos. Again, its place, which again is related to health. So we see that in beauty and health, and of the end of the kind of reality of forms for Aristotle, we see this kind of much more nuanced understanding of what is a body and what is a form. It's not, it's clean cut. Most people have a very strict, narrow, calcified identification, which, as Daniel's commenting, is factually not true because you're constantly changing. But yet there is an entity that is persistent, that's intelligible. So thus you can't dismiss it the other way 100% otherwise. But that confusion or that mystery is just basically the project of philosophy, I find, that we really can't think these thoughts unless we identify this tension from the getting. And that's what I have.
Delightful, and I'll give it to Daniel. No, it's very interesting to think. It if the body is not as rigid, then when we talk about health, you're going to be talking about the entire situation that, say, Daniel finds themselves in, right? And the field that comes with that. And it is interesting to talk. Embodiment is almost going to be tied to impolis, in geography. It's going to be tied to all of these different things, and you can't clearly separate it. Now, I think there's ditches on either side of the road because there's one part where you say, oh, well, the individual doesn't exist at all. It's very clear that there is a node of experience, but it's located in a network of variables that are fluid, right? Like, it's just the memories that Daniel have are not going through the chair, or as far as I know. Now, of course, we can talk about that. But there's this idea that I think when you get into Deleuze and he's talking about the individual, we do have to think about that as a node in a network, and you can't have a network without nodes, right? So there is a local entity. There are local entities. But now what Kornbosky is getting at is when we talk about the individual, if we talk about it as a node in a network, then we always have to be thinking about, well, ourselves as situated, not an identity. Daniel is a situation more than an identity. Jockin is a situation more than an individual. But what's very interesting is then the question is the following. What are the variables of that situation? And Mr. Lubert, it's good to see you, sir. Well, they're going to consist of the environment, of geography, of all of these different things that we are part of. And if you don't, and then the question becomes, can you be healthy then if you're not in a healthy environment, if you're not in healthy relationships, if you're not in a healthy political order? What does it mean to talk about health? Well, perhaps there's also then political ramifications to talk about health is merely, of defining the body kind of rigidly, because then it becomes your responsibility, right? It's not a social thing. It's not a communal thing. So politics and the philosophy of responsibility are strongly tied together and they're inseparable. But then what do you do if when people talk about social responsibility, we conflate the words social and state. So we mean the state needs to take care of it. There's also all of those problems, right? Like social, community, state, government, those things are conflated together. And obviously when Aristotle is talking about the polis, he has something different in mind. But I love those comments that you made. There's more to be said, but I'll pass it to Daniel. Daniel, it is wonderful to see you today, sir. Thank you for coming.
Lovely to be here. I hope my sound's coming through good. Brad. I want to add some points to what's been said. I appreciated Simon's inclusion of this some practice to interface with whales. This came out in the Philosophy Portal session this last Sunday with the resident man Jacob Kishier, and this idea of constellation therapy. So the conversation was about the differences perhaps between like a psychoanalytic approach, which is at least has a propensity towards a one-on-one engagement between analyst and analysand, and then feeling what the limits of that might be in terms of healing that happens at a collective level. So like constellation work that is done. That tends to be more toward the side of body work and what those differences might be. And it came up in that instance as well, interfacing with non-human entities. So the example of constellating, like a community constellating a river, like what happens in there, what happens when that kind of sense making is used, like what is our capacity there. I think this kind of conversation is close to that kind of biblical warning about divining, or about consulting uh, different spirits or even ancestral spirits, about communing with the dead, about communing with dead spirits as opposed to a living spirit. That's a valuable inclusion, at least I think, in terms of thinking about it. Like one way that it's been to me from someone who intentionally works with what they call nature spirits, is that like if you look at nature, it's it's good at concealing itself. So often people will interface with something that by its nature is concealing itself, and then it can actually be quite dangerous. You can be tricked by interfacing that kind of spirit. I mean, this is coming from um, Jiddu Krishnamurti. He also makes this a similar kind of observation about nature spirits and their tricking man. So there's like inclusion into the body stuff, and then also Simon, the way that you were explaining, kind of playing with a self sense, essentially like your moment to moment self sense, and then realizing like a degree of playfulness or serious play in that. And I touched on how that might be like a sense making capacity that we could use more. But for me, I'm very interested in linking this to Daniel's notion of an indestructible map, and especially like a map of body. So there's these different systems that map out to maybe like chakras or the anatomy of the human body, and then maybe even like a subtle anatomy of the human body. And there's a guy, Mark Gerard Murphy, who collaborated in the Rosy Cross conference, who he does a lot of work around Kundalini syndrome, or trying to approach Kundalini syndrome or psychosis from a Lacanian perspective. And one of the observations that he makes with people that are coming to him with what generally gets spoken about as like spiritual psychosis is that they can develop an attachment to the body map that has given them maybe some guidance or clarity. So they try and fit their self-sense to a body map, to an image of a body map, which can be the very cause for perpetuation of a certain kind of suffering, or not realizing something that wants to emerge by itself. And I think there's an association here with the kind of getting this mostly from Cadell, of putting drive before myth, or like the drive mythifies reality. So there's the body map that one has can be like putting the myth ahead of one's drive in terms of one's self-sense, which can be the very obstruction that precludes you from realizing your and I have to say something ridiculous like subtle anatomy, truly, or something. I don't know. Uh, there's something there also interesting in terms of linking it to a notion of health, because if we are networked or like embedded in family, community, state, etc., and this all situates us, and all of our desires and our movements and our self-sense are related to the way that life moves around us and the way that we move through life. This, whatever is being pointed to in terms of awakening or Kundalini, is something that it's going to interface with health, but it's not really interested in helping you to like function well in the setup as it is. It might have and it will say something ridiculous again, like a more primal drive, and that might be disturbing, and it might disrupt your capacity to function in your social situation, exactly like the kinds of people that Mark Gerard Murphy is working with, people who, by means of some experience, are induced into what can be said as like a psychosis, but they can't function. As I was also speaking to Dimitri the other day, yesterday, in terms of madness. This can also be thought of in the madness of being situated, but also not being placed. And there's a certain health in terms of coming to one's madness, but how we mediate that culturally is important, because people are going crazy. Let me put it down there.
Beautifully put. And the session on Resident Man was wonderful. I was really glad to see Matthew and Jacob there. I'll give it to Luber and then back to Simon. It's very interesting too, because on that notion of madness, there's a funny way, which for me, if you don't face the non-rational or things that seem mad, like considering yourself as a field versus an individual, then actually you get madness. You get the unintegrated libido that blows up. Like one of the ideas of the map is indestructible is if you think the point of rationality is the realization of self-consistency, then the logic of rationalization is totalization, thus totalitarian, thus total war, thus world wars, following a whole comment. But actually, the whole dialectics of enlightenment is based for me on David Hume warning about the arising of total war because societies were increasingly based on a philosophical premise versus practical needs. Like Bernard de Jouvenel makes the same point, is the idea that the king actually was not nearly as powerful as you think. He had to go convince the lords, this war will help you get food, it will help you get land. He had to bring it to practical concerns. But what really concerned David Hume is when the king could say, we're fighting for God, we're fighting for democracy, we're fighting for freedom. Well, that's unbound. Anyone can be in that war. But if I'm trying to convince you to fight for food, only the people who are starving can be in that war. So we saw this kind of totalization that is occurring. And he really did see it as the unleashing. The phrase that Foucault and Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment people talk about is a barbaricism of refinement, where the very effort of thinking would lead to a certain self-destruction. I like the term self-effacement. And in that sense, that if you don't integrate with the things that you're talking about, oh, you get a certain madness, all right. The problem, like, it's just, it's a global total madness that's quote unquote rational. Like, what's a worse madness? A madness that you can rationalize as enlightenment, or a madness that you have to face as strange until you come to do it in the practices and you see the health in it, right? There's the problem of the madness that emerges from totalization is it seems very logical, which is true madness, is when you have a madness that you can't even see as madness, right? And so that's something Hume is big on. I think also what you're saying, I mean, the other thing that comes to mind that's very interesting, and then I'll give it to Luber and Simon. When we talk about health, it's very, like, what do we mean? What is health? Just to speak off the cuff, like, we consider someone healthy if they can run to the mailbox and back, right? Like, if they can't even run to the mailbox, we say, oh, you're not very healthy. Or if they are breathing heavily after walking. Generally, we tie health to an idea of capacity. You can do something, right? Now, obviously, we'll say you're healthy if you're not dead. Oh, you must have some glimmer of health because you're not dead. We sometimes assume health is life expectancy, how long you live, but that can be kind of a negative thing because we don't always control if we're in an accident or not. Often health, if it's a meaningful term, is tied to some sort of vitality, some sort of capacity for, and the question becomes, if we're going to take seriously the idea of field versus overly reified individual, what is the capacity or the vitality of the field of which would be an indication of health, right? Well, I think a lot of things are, and Aspasia, good to see you, and Christian, good to see you. Thank you for coming, sir. Can we, in fact, encounter difference? Can we encounter otherness? Can we, in fact, be surprised by ideas we haven't heard before? Do we have the capacity to not have a knee-jerk reaction to something we disagree with? Do we have the ability to disagree and not hate everyone? Like, do we actually, of course, the geopadia, beauty, do we have those capacities, right? I think if we take seriously the notion of the, when we talk about the body, the concept is sometimes too rigid. If we actually open that up and we ask about questions of health, you start going, do we have capacities for encounter? Do we have capacities for relationship? Can we have relationships that are not boring, right? Are you actually able to do the relationship in a manner that keeps it alive? Just like, can you run to the mailbox and back without getting tired, right? And that, of course, then connects health to energy. Can you maintain a certain social energy? Can you maintain a certain energy as you run, right? And we connect energy with health. And then, as Mr. Jockin has so brilliantly pointed out, and I think is very important, is that for Aristotle, without health, health is tied to virtue, and without virtue and health as such, you can't even do philosophy. That these things are actually strongly tied together. But I will give it to Mr. Luber and Simon. Mr. Luber, it is good to see you on this fine day. I hope you are doing well. And if you're going to be setting off fireworks, make sure you don't have an egg sandwich nearby or you'll freak out and actually blow the firework up on you. Just make sure you don't do that, Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber.
Um, that is really funny. When you guys talk about, well, I had some initial thoughts about what you were saying, Daniel, and then the topic of madness comes up. I mean, I don't know, Jock, and if you touched on it, it kind of came in late, but like divine madness is like the first thing that comes to mind, and the importance of that. And I wonder if a question that I have is, like, Daniel, I remember a while ago you said to really encounter difference means, and I'm not quoting you verbatim, but like this sentiment is like to really encounter difference means you encounter somebody that basically isn't open to change, isn't open to hearing what you have to say, but yet you have to like continue to like encounter it. There, in a certain sense, you have to like force yourself to like continue to encounter it, because the initial, response when someone's like "fuck off" is okay. I'll fuck off or fuck you, and that's just like that's not the point. So I guess in today's day and age, we need to have a appropriate relationship with divine madness, which essentially, in terms of that example that I just gave, means to continue to be in that tension where someone's telling you to fuck off and you don't fuck off. But now I'm just wondering, like, how do you have essentially an appropriate relationship with madness in today's day and age? Like, I understand the philosophy behind it, but like, actually, like, I'm asking this question because like, I understand what you guys are saying, or from what I've heard so far. But like, if someone, like, if my girlfriend were to ask me, like, okay, like, what is, like, how do I do that? I don't think I would be any help. I could talk about like these concepts and like, oh, like, well, if you read this little small book by Joseph Piper called Divine Madness, you can learn about this, and if you X, Y, and Z. But I don't think I actually know how to do it. And maybe like me just being obsessive about the philosophy is avoiding it, the actual like practical application. Like, I'm just speaking for myself here. Like, I I wonder if I'm just avoiding it, but I digress. So I'm curious to your thoughts on that. What I was going to talk about, which is basically the variables of a situation. So the variables of a situation, like from Lacanian terms, like, just because I kind of finished your talk, Daniel, with Cadell, brilliant. I think it's beautiful, by the way, how you guys can just like, for the first time meet in person, you have all this energy from all this like online, this online relationship, and you could just talk for literally like 8 hours. Like, it was insane. And then, real quick, it was so funny when Peep, on the seventh episode of that, Reed opening the door and just like running by in the background. So it's a good laugh. But basically, from like a Lacanian perspective, thinking about how the gap morphs in time and how it's able to morph in time, essentially conditionalism, the condition of possibility for the situation. And if you start from that point, it's always from a time standpoint, basically. And when you think about it like that, I don't see, and this is a claim here, so please feel free to push back. That's a story. Like, that literally is a story, and I would say if you are not thinking about it in terms of a story, you're not actually thinking about it. I would say that is the dimension of storytelling, and like, yeah, like dogmatically, that's what it is. But I would love to hear if it's something else. So with that being said, when you think about in terms of a story, I see it as like you have to think about it colloquially. It's like, oh, the main character, like who's the main character of the situation, and from there, that's the initial reference point of the story. So th- this reference point is always pointing to itself and the world. So it's that main character is essentially the initial access point of the internal self pointing to itself of the world in which that main character is situated in, which that main character is in. And that self-referencing point, like I talk about it in this book that I keep saying I'm gonna publish, but it's not, fucking published. I'm fucking annoying. No publisher, hit me up, please. But I call that the operation. So like when you think about this operation, which essentially affords from a linear standpoint how you understand this static points of self-referencing are able to move in time. Um, that you're you're well, for one, you're taking ontology of relation seriously, which is embedded in conditionalism, essentially. But what you're realizing is each point that's self-referencing itself changes. Like you have to like what each variable is constituted off of is something that is able to change. Like it's not static, but yet there's something in that variable in real time that reveals itself to be static at the same time. So I think I guess my point is that it's a bit of a head fuck because it's not as simple as basically having bullets of these are the variables of the situation. So like when you're trying to create a community, create a society, if you will, you have to think about it in terms of and I think the founding fathers of America did a pretty good job given their time thinking about creating points that can be flexible, that are breathable, that can move in time. And that includes like to relate to the video with Daniel and Cadell, um, the father figure seeing themselves as essentially what Laban Pascal did with the talk with Cadell, where he riffed off of Michelle. This is a while ago. He riffed off of Michelle's bird analogy, where you're able to grip the bird in a way. You oscillate. There's this oscillation. So, in a certain sense, you're oscillating from basically self-annihilating yourself to self-giving yourself. You're circling the same dimension, but you keep moving from active to passive, from positive to negative, and like you keep it moving. And I think that is a skill that needs to be learned, that I don't think is something that's really like I didn't learn that in school. Like I don't think you have to learn that. And I don't think you can learn that in a traditional school like where I'm from. I think you kind of learn that from like me meeting like you, Dan, like a mentor, like my encounter with you, Jock, and like me meeting people that give you a difference, that open you up in such a way that you are forced to move positions, active to passive, positive to negative. Like their very being is what affords you to even do that. So, in other words, to pinpoint the variables of the situation, find a friend. Literally, find a friend and think with them. And then you start having your own thought and your own movement, so to speak, that follows that. Um, but yeah, I'll stop there and pass it off.
No, and I am glad we found each other as friends. Isn't that wonderful? No, 100% with finding a friend. I basically think you can't think without friendship. And obviously, friendship is big in Aristotle, Cicero, other people, Agamben, etc. talk about friendship. I think we forget that friendship, philosophy, philo, is tied to this. The issue is I don't think we know what friendship is. And then, of course, the problem is, though, if you're not able to handle the shock of difference, you may only find friends with people who are similar to you that you relate to because they're like you. But the issue is, the friendship. If the evidence that friendship is there is precisely the ability to work through negativity and actually have something emerge, difference and all these things. Friends, 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 friends. That was like episode 100. I remember that song. I'm going to do a guitar riff. It's going to be amazing. Leonard Skinner or something like that. And so friendship, I think, is strongly, and actually, one of the reasons why I think school has failed to cultivate education is because it does not create environments of friendship. In fact, friends are who you're allowed to talk to outside the classroom. So you sure as heck are not going to talk about it in the classroom when in fact you need those things to go together as an incubator. I'll give it to Simon, Jock, and Dimitri here, and then anyone else. A few more things.
Daniel,
sir.
Sorry, real quick. Can't we just say, like, a lot of these heavy conversations, we could just boil it down to talking pretty, like, crudely, where we could just say, okay, how do we be friends? How do we make friendship, instead of talking about it in terms of like a dialectic, or basically like the subject, the psychoanalysis situation that I always hear about. Like,
Sure.
it's so complex, and I always think about, how can I talk about this with my girlfriend or people that have no fucking idea what we're talking about here. I feel like it could be translated in terms of friendship. Sorry, I just wanted
I
to.
think emphasizing friendship is a big deal, but one of the reasons why I think friendship, if we take this seriously, requires one philosophy, because one, philosophy gives you something to always talk about. You're also annihilating preassumptions. The friendship becomes exploratory versus just confirmation of sharing beliefs. Most people's friends are people they don't feel anxiety around because they share similar views, as opposed to friendship being with actually there is a feeling of anxiety, but you work through anxiety because because most people can associate health with never feeling exhausted, but then there's the health on the other side of going to the gym, right? So there are different questions. Also, too, the issue of friendship is actually quite there's a depth to it, because you have to think the problems of connection, forgiveness, and wisdom, which is quite a deep problem. Biblically, we might think of the images of the dove, connection, lamb, forgiveness, and the serpent as wisdom. Because the problem becomes, what do you do if your friend does something that is wrong or immoral, or does something wrong to someone else, and the other person doesn't want you to interact? You get these social dynamics, and it's only a matter of time before someone who was a friend or you were connected with, there is a problem that emerges. How do you handle that? This gets into needing virtue. Also, here's a problem. If you do the thing of, well, they did something wrong and you cut them off, that doesn't seem very forgiving. But then also, if you can continue to connect with someone who is doing something wrong, that actually can be monstrous. You might be enabling a monster. Oh, and by the way, though, if you cut off connection with someone, that can make someone more a monster. So you have to run this risk of being of connection that could destroy everything. But actually, if you don't have that connection, then when people are isolated, they become more monstrous and more resentful. So there's a very complicated social dynamic problem there. This is why belonging again to one ends like the problem of forgiveness is like an infinite problem. And we can also think about it tied together with connection, enablement, because who you're connected with, you can enable. And if that somebody upsets someone, or what if they have bad beliefs? There are all these things that come into the forefront. Friendship is easy to think until you have a problem emerge. And then what do you do? Oh, and by the way, if we're talking friendship across global pluralism, the likelihood of misunderstanding or different personality types conflicting or misunderstanding one another is incredibly high. Therefore, people are likely to then go to associations with like them. But now we have internally consistent systems, people sharing political associations, and all the conflicts that can emerge with that, right? So it's a very, very deep problem. I don't disagree that there's a very real sense that a lot of this is about the capacity for friendship, but the capacity for friendship is actually very, very deep. And actually do note that most adults, as they get older, even people they are close friends with, they drift away from because of simply time, energy. They're embarrassed by how their kids act. They're embarrassed by how, they have a job that's less prestigious as someone else. There are all these variables that pull people apart, which means here's the issue. If there's a certain pregnancy of creative possibility in connection, that connection is not as easy to maintain as it seems because there is this negativity that emerges. In relation, you feel lack. So there's that doubleness, right? Where there is, like you're saying, a creative possibility that occurs in relation, but also in order to have that creative possibility, you have to suffer lack. This is the Deleuze-Lacan crossover, and you could also speak Desmond. That can come across on these things. A few more things I'll say, and then give it to Simon, Jockin, and Dimitri on this question of the madness. I tie like what does it mean to be talking about the madness we're talking about? One, to choose to face those social dynamics. Why would you rationally do that? Why not just find people that are like you and are not going to make you suffer that way, right? I link the madness with the absolute choice. And if you want to be intimate, if you want an intimate connection with someone like you're talking your girlfriend or friends, you will have intimate connection with people of whom with you make an absolute choice, which is a choice that you cannot rationally justify. That is, it doesn't have a justification. You have to be in it to do it. It is its own absolute grounding. And also, every time you change the variables in the story, that is going to require an absolute choice because you're not sure if in the new arrangement, and isn't it mad? Isn't it madness to change something that was working? So here's the issue. Every time the variables have to shift, and thus the story develop, is going to require an absolute choice. But here's the main problem. How do you make the determination by which way you organize the variables if you are not allowed to rationally justify it, right? Well, it has to be according to the theme, using your work, but the theme cannot be rationally justified, nor can you exactly explain it, as in justify it by knowing the outcome. You have to kind of be attuned to it, but how are you attuned to it? By what means are you attuned to it? Well, now we're getting into embodiment. As Facia, Seth, and I, we've been talking about authentic resonance. Now we're talking about working on the embodiment work where you're like the absolute choice requires you to make a choice without rationality. What does that mean? How do you do that? How do you make a choice that is not primarily based on rationality? That's not to say that there is not rationality involved at all, but the rational function is often actually going to be more negative. And if it's going to be negative, to leave open the open-endedness, how are you organizing your decision-making in the open-endedness? How are you following the theme? Well, it can't be reducible to rationality. So it has to be some very odd capacities that are hard to put into words. And yet you can sense, which is getting into embodiment, which is getting into taking seriously the field, intuition, beauty, all of these different things. You're going to need things that are quote unquote non-rational or on the side of perception versus thinking, which is another distinction we talk about. And basically, I think intimacy can emerge, though, with people of whom are capable of doing that with you. And that is difficult, though. But let me give it to Simon. Simon, it's wonderful to have you, sir. Simon.
Excellent. I wanted to tie it back to the perception of madness and different forms of madness. Also bringing it back to this axis of that we are compounded, or that health is situated temporally with ancestors and offspring, but also with individual and collective. What I notice in my practice is that we are sort of this body is like a portal to living ghosts. And in us, our ancestors live, but the way that they live is a sort of legacy coding. So we have anchored within us the biophysical programming that they created by surviving. And this includes also non-human coding, because this goes back before there was Homo sapiens and further back. So we theoretically have access to the whole library of different encodings of ancestral patterns. And what I've been noticing is that we walk around, particularly in this day and age, we walk around with a lot of very, very dysfunctional coding based on surviving under horrible conditions or under empire conditions or under, let's say, realities with certain axioms that don't make any sense within the current context. And so a lot of the shamanic or the healing work is done around sort of putting ancestors out on the boat, or putting them out on the to pasture with a certain sense of coding that is no longer viable. I was speaking to a man who was initiated into a tradition. I think it's from the Dogon tribe in Africa. And their specific spiritual or religious tradition is tied to ancient Egyptian practices. And what I noticed in his speak, and he was also quite lucid about this, he said that he was constantly hearing the ancestors speak. And if I tuned into him, it also felt like he was multiple things at the same time, sort of channeling through. And I got the idea of like, okay, but where is he? He is sort of in the middle, sort of just voicing this. And he was doing this in an ongoing state. We were just having a conversation. This was not ceremonially. Later that night, I had a dream about him where he was in a car and he drove his car exactly between two buildings in a very narrow passageway where the car couldn't move forward or backwards anymore, but couldn't open. And I just saw him sitting in the car. And I was thinking like, this is a form of madness. It is a form of sort of, how would you say, sort of possession. I think most of these expressions that we step in are a form of possession. It only depends on what is healthy. What is a healthy form of possession? What do we interact with? Which kind of spirits do we interact with that are healthy for expressing ourselves, but also perpetuating this physical body, but also healthy for the context that you're in. So I found that interesting, and I really liked the point that Daniel made about concealment and about the sort of the elusiveness of these nature spirits, because I immediately got the image of several types of the energy tied to insects that use mimicry or these kind of things. So concealing their true nature and this trickster aspect, and that that sparked off a lot of interesting thoughts for me also concerning shapeshifting and what kind of fields that we shapeshift to, which ones are, let's say, more savory than others. So that.
No, delightful. And it's very interesting because as you're speaking too on ancestors, it's very interesting because there's this idea that one of the problems today is that younger generation doesn't have elders, they don't have mentors, they don't have ways to kind of be guided, right? And it's kind of interesting how there's kind of that theme. Also in Hegel, there's this notion of we need to like study, one of the problems is the temptation of thought is to think the future as opposed to think the past or to study history, right? And like there's something about history that's quite absolute. I also think it's interesting what you're saying about healthy possession because there's a way in which, like, I always think about reading books as just talking with the past or talking, you could say, with spirits, right? Because you're literally having, in a sense, a conversation with Hume or Aristotle, right? And it's very important. Do you let it's really interesting, too, because there's a real sense in which if you don't let anything possess you, well, then actually, you're still going to be possessed. You're just going to be possessed, quote unquote, by the zeitgeist, right? Where you have to be intentional about what kind of voices you put into yourself, right? Which are your friends, which are the books you're reading, like what are you letting enter you, right? And it's very interesting because instead of, I think very often people think about, well, I'm going to create myself, I'm going to make my own person. Well, that's kind of a trick as opposed to being intentional about what you let go through you. What masters do you put yourself under? What environments do you let work through you? But of course, there are certain mentors or certain, I'll say, spirits that you actually can't let go through you without the right health, without the right virtue, without the right capacities. And also you can't self-defend yourself from being manipulated by the TV or by the internet or by something like that that's entering you. And so it's interesting too to think about health is also tied to the firmability, there's a better term, of your field, of your membrane, as people talk about. Like if you don't actually gain certain skills, you don't have control what enters and what doesn't. And then you're just going to reflect the algorithm as opposed to geopedia, as Jacques taught. Like you're just going to reflect algebraic thinking. You're just going to think the logic of capital, exchange, etc., so forth. But it's just very interesting, too, that this idea that it takes a whole lot of work to actually hear the past or to study history or to receive to learn from the ancestors, to learn from generations and how one can actually dedicate an entire life of thought to that work. And yet we often dedicate thought to just memorization or thinking the future or making, or imagining the future, as opposed to listening to the other, as Dimitri is saying, because there's something about the past that is the actual other. Like it is actually history actually occurred. It is radically other too, in the sense of you don't live in that moment, and there's actually something that's very powerful to be learned by that. But it was lovely what you were saying. I will give it to Mr. Jockin, Dimitri, and Mr. Luber. Mr. Jockin.
Well, since Luber brought up Divine Madness, I feel like I'm inclined I have to respond now. And Luber's here, Luber's still here. So on that, I read and actually on your note, Daniel, in terms of responsiveness to other, the very fact, like here's a good example. I didn't have any preposition to come on this call to remember Phaedrus, where Divine Madness is discussed by Plato, and then I went, let me go look back. Actually, it's actually a fun example of it, because I actually went back to my lecture notes from the course, grabbed the citations in the area I talked about, and then went to the primary text again, like on the call to double check. It's related to the idea, because Lou was asking the basic questions, like, and how can we have a kind of dispositional orientation to deal with difference? And it's related to remembrance, anamnesis for Plato. It's this higher remembering, which is of the body for Aristotle, especially. It's a very important aspect. What you choose to remember in times of stressors or conflict is actually one of the key indicators of how you're going to respond to a situation or circumstance. I think Daniel, I think the Aspasia talk you had, remember I caught part of it. Remember you talking about this. You talked about this as a point of one of the elements of proving human agency is the fact of you can perceive something and then remember something completely else, something completely different that is not by necessity the case. The fact that you as an entity with your power of memory can remember basically necessarily something completely contingently, related to the stimulus presented to you. I think of very much and that's what Divine Madness is for Plato. It's the remembering of the beautiful. That this encounter of this thing in front of you, you get the strike of recollection, anamnesis of the higher beauty. Basically, that was from the beginning, that you recall. And also, by the way, other notes built on this, that this element of the beautiful is this double move strike of the particular individual, not just an abstract universal, right? And I think that's the general disposition is that, I generally agree with the scholars who say that for Plato, the question becomes of the evaluation of a diversity of goods. How do you adjudicate on those? That is an equality of virtue. I think when you read Aristotle's accounts of what virtue is in Nicomachean Ethics, I agree with the scholars who say it has to be adjudicated in beauty, which seems so contrary to typical positions about beauty. It's the only way to really answer this question, especially encountering moments of difference, because you don't have to be like the key part, and this actually relates to this larger, that's such an abstract way to talk about it, and more concretely, because Luber wants concreteness, is using this language developed with Javier and Michelle about geopedia versus algorithms, in the sense that algorithms give you exit. That's a logical decision. You can exit. You can block, isolate, exit, not associate, and versus return. That language was developed in a conversation. The idea of return, reconciliation, remembrance is a movement of choice, and it creates a new possibility. Versus when you do exits, you shut down possibility. That's kind of one of the quality distinctions of them. And the key is that it's not by any mode of necessity that you have to do it. It's not by strict necessity that it has to be the case to do the return. The fact that it actually gets only its power from the fact that it's a contingent choice, not a necessity. So just on Luber's point about Divine Madness, just to reflect on that, this is what I can just kind of synthesize some Aristotle and Plato on that point, talking about that. And it very much requires memory, and that quality of memory is bodily. It has a bodily aspect to it. In fact, and kind of as I'm hinted at, when you read Aristotle, you find out that you can't do this operation of memory as an isolated soul. It's with the body. If your body's busted, you don't have moral virtue, you can't do this. There's reasons for that. We'll go about it in the course, but just to build that part. Another thing related to it, again, is like the idea of like, how can we enter these spaces of receptivity to other people with our thought, is taking in people's perspectives and reflecting on it. So right now I'm actually getting into a whole line of inquiry related to excess, limit, boundary, because of the discussions in this group. And I wouldn't have done this if I was on this, unless I was in this room. You kind of have to put yourself in a kind of dispositional state to be able to respond. I just say this because this is very different than if I was watching this discussion after the fact on YouTube versus me being committed to being in a chair with my notebook, taking in the vibes of the room and responding to it. Yes, I saw in the chat before, basically, Aristotle vibe check. Yes, that's very much that's a good way to put it. So that's my things I want to share.
No, we're going to have Aristotle dubstep. It's going to be tremendous. And Jacob Cashier, it is good to see. No, what you're getting at is extremely important. I'll give it to Dimitri, Luber, and then anyone else. Well, if at every point, so as Luber was saying, that there's a point in the story or the unfold, and we could think about if we take where there is human subjectivity and situation in the Korobowski sense, then you're talking story then. Because you have a character in a situation, ergo a story. And then it's interesting based on Simon's idea of the fields, of coming to terms with environment, whales, etc., so forth. Like you really can't have a good story if you don't know the setting either. Like a character that isn't part of the setting can actually not be very well storied, right? So this idea of thinking of fields and connection that are actually going to be necessary to have a character that is really embedded, right? Like why are Faulkner's characters so powerful? Because they are part of the setting. Yokoba County is the characters of Faulkner. You can't think of those characters separate of the setting. So I could talk about Chekhov, literature, Gokul, etc., so forth, right? So this is very important. So there's also a sense in which you actually can't be a good character in a story if you're not environmental in this sense, or you've actually come to terms with the environment, but then you have to have a more permeable field, membrane, etc., so forth. But when we come to this question of the arrangement of the variables, and how does one do it? If you only have algebraic thinking, then you'll exit and you'll just go back to the previous form, and now the theme is lost. And you've actually, and now in a real sense, the problem is now you have, well, it's really interesting because in a way, it's now is a story, as in it's completed and it's dead, as opposed to it, and instead of it continuing to go, right? But then how do you determine the way the variables move together? I think of Mr. Cashier's statement with Matthew on there's a resonance crisis. There's a lack of the ability to have resonance, right? Because what you're pointing out, Mr. Jockin, which I think is very important, is this idea if you have two goods, so the example I always make is the birdie and donkey. If you have two equally piles of grains and you have a donkey between them, how do you decide between the grains? Well, the story goes the donkey dies because you can't make a rational choice, right? So the donkey dies. Every time you have to change the variables in the story, you're in a birdie and donkey situation. Therefore, you have to make an absolute choice. Every single time and so the donkey needs resonance. The donkey needs authentic resonance. Aspasia's term, Jacob's beauty, virtue. Or you're going to be stuck between these piles of grain. And basically, the claim is that my claim would be that every ideology that is a map cannot deal with the problem of the birdie and donkey. It will eventually reach its point of what I call the girdle point, and it actually, if it only has rationality, will have to become pathological at that point. It has to accept its non-rational basis, which means something that is not reducible to rationality, ergo bodywork, ergo libido, ergo resonance, etc., so forth. And if you don't have those capacities, well, you're going to become pathological at that point, or you're not going to be able to remove the variables, as Mr. Luber is talking about. So you have to have resonance, right? But here's the issue to resonance. As Simon is talking about, that I also think also speaks to Jacob, is so that idea of the separation of the hand in that conversation with Seth and Aspasia, where that crazy moment where I went, oh my gosh, I can stop thinking and my hand doesn't vanish. Whoa. That means there's a difference between thinking and perceiving. This was a really big deal for me because it meant that the act of perceiving my hand and the act of thinking about my hand could actually be split apart, which created agency. Well, and that, I think, is getting into health and fields and what you have to do for resonance. Because if you're always thinking, if you don't have control over your thinking, then you're just pulled by the algorithm. You're just pulled by rationality. Right? So you have to be able to pull yourself apart from phenomenon and thinking. Well, one of the reasons I think people don't do that is because of, well, traumas. We were talking about generational trauma. We were talking about pain. Like if you pull back and actually give yourself agency to think, well, your thinking may go in here instead of just thinking about what's in front of you. And now you may suffer some of those traumas you've been repressing, right? If you separate thinking from phenomenon or perception, well, then you have less of a way to bind thinking, and then you have all these hurts. you haven't faced, or you have all of these pains that haven't been dealt with, right? And so then this, I think, gets tied to when you're talking about virtue and health. That's also going to be tied to healing, without which it becomes very difficult to engage in the resonance, which if you don't have the resonance, then it's inevitable that you face a birdie and donkey situation and die. And the story end. Because it's only a matter of, especially between maps. Between maps, you're dealing with birdie and donkey situations because maps are in which rationality is defined. So basically, under global pluralism, it's inevitable that the average person increasingly finds a situation where the only way to make the right decision is going to be something is going to be in the line of resonance, authentic resonance. And if you don't have that, you're going to end up in these impasses, and then you're going to blame whoever put you in that impasse and go to war. Whoever puts you in that situation of being the donkey between those two piles of grain, oh, and that's the bad guy, that's the other, we got to get rid of them. So I think the stakes are very high. But let me give it to Dimitri and then Mr. Luber. Dimitri, it is good to see you, sir.
Yeah, good to see you. Good to see you all. Yeah, we started with the voice, then we went to madness. I'd like to pick up that thread. So now for 8 months, I've been thinking about the voice with Naden Dollar's book, A Voice and Nothing More. And one of the things he says, relating is basically starting with the question: how does the voice relate to language, and how does the voice relate to the body? Which is not it's not clear cut. The body is not just it doesn't just like have language and inhabits that language as like a signifying machine, right? Language as a thing which I don't create. I'm at the behest of grammatical rules, all of that. So it's there's a certain self-serving there which occurs, which is actually what psychoanalysis calls perversion, right? So basically the signifier has no way to identify the subject. Or put differently, identification and the subject are asymmetrical, or the subject is that which is actually slipping from every identification. Now, the signifier doesn't really care about it. At least it can go on without, having to deal with the recognition of the subject. Sometimes, anyhow. Not always, but that's something that language can do. It can cause perversions. So what call autonomous rationality, Daniel. You've called it like this. I think basically that's exactly what I'm getting at. Sorry, I have to walk inside. So besides that, there's the voice, which is also not just an animalistic sound, right? So for Naden Dollar, to make a long story short, because I have to get to the door, someone's at my place, so I hope I can resume later. But for Naden Dollar, the voice is at the intersection of language and the body. So it's not reducible to either, but it's irreducible to either. So I'm really rude. I should open the door.
No, that's magnificent. And please come back whenever it's convenient for you. I really like the point that the voice is between the mind and body. I think that is really true. And that's why these spaces of the social coordination mechanism and what people have called, quote unquote, dialogos, or what we're doing here, is extremely important, because I'm of the opinion, as came out as we were talking about with Seth and Aspasia, that basically what is required, we have to basically dwell in spaces of the between, the metaxis, I'll use the Desmond term, of thinking and perceiving as much as possible, mind and body, and be there as much as possible. Not just mind, not just body, because there is a instability there that actually is the creative possibility. Like the between space of perceiving the hand and thinking about the hand. Like that kind of between it. And there's something about speaking that speaking, the act of creative writing, the act of artistic possibility, there's more, there's a list of these, that actually are in these between spaces that are critical for habits of betweenness, habits of really seeing the human being as not just a stable state, but more of a flowing and moving situation. I believe that basically those kind of activities, and the voice is a critical one, are absolutely critical for training authentic resonance, as Aspasia talks about, and resonance, dealing with the resonance crisis that Jacob's talking about. And of course, the reason for this is that the voice is tied to the libido, as Lacan talks about. It is tied to sexuality. It is tied to actually the creative act. There is a sublimation that occurs there. And the voice becomes very important. And of course, I would argue then that using the voice requires actually, as Aspasia is pointing out, the other senses as well. One has to speak from the full body, and Seth will work on. That's extremely important. But I'll pause and give it to Mr. Luber, and then if anyone has anything else, Mr. Luber, please.
So like, it's I want to talk about the non-rational for a sec. It's funny that the reason why something like that had to be thought, in my opinion, is that the ground in which as a collective we try to approach being is called rationality. It's called logic. Like when you go to college, and you want to be a philosopher, it's logic. It's analytic philosophy. It's not a lot of what we're doing and talking about. Like, there is no like Heidegger class really. Like, you might find like a niche, like one-off kind of thing, but those are like more or less outliers. Like, at most you'll hit Hegel and kind of like that's as far as you might go in that world. The only like, if the ground had a different understanding of itself, in other words, the necessary bar to do critical thinking wasn't something as I, I always think about it in terms of time. So it's like something just linear, something that's just very static, something very fixed. Then you wouldn't need something like non-rational. The reason why non-rational is because that ground is just fixed. So why I like theme as like a ground is because when you approach that ground and you make a decision, it's just rational at that point, because the essentially the ground itself is the non-rational. It switches, it flips. And we're at a point where it's almost like what's really important is like in terms of your work, Daniel, it's like the explanation, like belonging and the explanation, like that in today's age is like more important, and you could argue at least is more important because people need to understand why the non-rational is the case now, like why that is. You need to like start thinking in terms of that. But then almost like when you think about like future thinkers, then you're really going to get into the address, because now people have already they've digested the explanation to a point where they like, at least now, at least how I see it as it is, nobody's even close to the explanation. Like, the explanation's ahead of the game. So the address is like way ahead. Like, that's like it's just going to be way over people's heads even more in general, I think. And the question is, like, with friendship, it does that. How do you persuade people to see the ground differently in this not in this dynamic way, where it's essentially the ground itself is the non-rational, and then any type of approaching that ground, any type of work, any type of thing like that is just rational. In that sense, when that happens, the world will look like this. I am choosing to continually encounter someone that says fuck off, and no one thinks that's weird. That's the world. But like, if you do that now, I'll have my mom and dad be like, "What are you doing? Like, you got to stop. You got to stop." That's what most people would do. Like, you'd be seen as an idiot at a certain point. But like, we're just so far away from a world where the normal is basically the inverse, like I was just saying. So I go back to the practical of how do we get people there? How do we push people there? Is it by explaining these concepts? I think from a philosopher standpoint, when you're coming out of college like me, like basically it's like before I read Heidegger, I definitely thought in terms of that way more. Like wait, the ground is logic, and then I encountered Heidegger and it just like destroyed me, kind of thing. Um, but if you're not a philosopher, what do you do? What do you do to get there? Like it bewildered. I'm like actually genuinely like perplexed by it. Um, in other words, like kind of the comment on what you were saying about like Desmond, like what you were saying, Desmond will call it like betweening. Like he puts the ing on it. How do you get people to do do betweenings? In other words, like like even hearing that is just odd. You know, I'm not gonna like. It's just a weird way of even framing it. Or it just sounds weird, but like the only thing that I can think of is you making a friend and they exemplify that. Like like it's like they're doing something that's so off the beaten track, but it works for them. Like seeing it work in action, and then that gets you potentially the motivation to get there. But even on that front, you need the conceptual to understand why that even makes sense for them. So I don't know. It's a mess. It's a mess. It really is a mess. But yeah, I'll pass it off.
No, magnificent questions. I'll give it to Daniel and then Christian. Mr. Rivera, it's good to see you today. So first off, the issue is as soon as you do something non-rational, rationality consumes it. The phenomenology of rationality is significant here in the paper, The Truism of the Rational. So the moment you do body work or say do virtue, then you get the fruits and you say, oh, it was rational to do. But this is where memory is extremely important because you have to remember that it was rational retrospectively. Initially, it required courage or that of which was seemingly irrational, because this is the other issue. The non-rational seems irrational to others, actually. And actually, the feeling of doing the non-rational, and I prefer the language of non-rational, some people may say trans-rational, but the problem is trans sounds transcendent and nice. I think you want to emphasize the negativity of the non-rational because it feels irrational, it feels stupid, and it feels like you can't explain it. But then on the other side, it's like, oh, of course, right? So there's this, that's a consuming element that requires a certain remembering, remember, how did you get here? You know, what brought you, you know, what actually led to this? And if you pay attention to that, then you ultimately see the rational, non-rational back and forth becomes non-rational with the non in parentheses, that you're actually always already using rationality in concert with a non-rationality that you simply forgot. Like there actually is no such thing as rationality that is not reliant on a non-rationality. We just forget that. We just experience everything in terms of logic, and so we forget it, right? But you have to remember it, and then once you do that, you get the Hegelian always already non-rationality with the non in parentheses of the rationality, and now that you know that that is the true character of thought, which is Ousi, then you begin to actually think it anew in according to new principles, and that opens up everything we talk about. So I think that's very important. The idea of, so there's a few things. If you say I need to experience people that say F you, like those are the people I need to experience, well, that's a stable state, actually. So you can't say, okay, if we're having a good time, that's bad. We got to find people that give us a bad time because then that's actually stabilizing and it's falling into a certain morality. And also you're conflating the good and the beautiful. It's good to deal with people that hate you. It's good to deal with that negativity. And you're saying it's good to do that. So we have to make the guiding principle of our actions not it's good to do that, but it has to give rise to a certain beauty. What I would say is we absolutely have to be the kind of subjects who can be surprised by FU and not lose it. This is where surprise and encounter is a big deal. Like, it's not that you go looking Not that you think negativity, it's that when it inevitably occurs, you can handle it. Right. And I would actually argue if you don't have geopathic or experiences of friendship, that you won't have the resources to actually handle that negativity. Right. And the handling of surprise is therefore the emergence of the beautiful. Right. So this, and actually, in my experience, it is, well, the actual ability to handle the surprise of the FU without exiting is way harder than people realize. And it takes years and years and years and years of work to actually gradually and slowly get better more and more of that. But to your point, yes, it is going to entail the ability to handle someone saying F you. And if you haven't done work on, say, your nervous system, if you haven't done work in your body, if you haven't done stuff to control your breathing, then you're probably going to blow up when that occurs. Right? So this gets into things like the body work. And if you actually believe that you're in a situation that your very being is inseparable from the relation with that person, that is also going to be imperative to try to respond properly. And if they're part of the story with you, then you don't want to ruin the story, right? The last thing I'll say quickly, and then give it to Daniel, Christian, and Mr. Rivera, is on this idea of how do we spread what we're talking about, per se. How do you get more and more people to get it? Well, I think we're modeling it. That's where the YouTube social coordination mechanism is a big deal. People can see it. It's being modeled. I think also, how do you get people betweening? Well, historically, you got people betweening because God told you to, so you have to, even if you don't want to. There's a religion was there. As we got rid of religion, economics had you do it because you were betweening with people on the trade route because you were trading things, right? So basically now we have to do betweening, and we've talked about it in terms of beauty. And you have to genuinely believe that betweening, you need it, that you genuinely need it, that there is something about the betweening that you will not be a human being without it. And how do you get people to genuinely believe that? Well, I think it will require things like beauty and shine and changing the school system away from trivia to all exams and a lot of other things. But it's a very good question, but I'll give it to Daniel. Daniel, please.
Fuck. Oh. It's tough, eh? That and even like performatively, I love this thread, and it's really helping me clarify and see some things, or give language to some things that I see often. The non-rational, when it is put into play or invoked via voice. So like transformative phrases, like in the comments we had ideas of chord, of anchor, of hook. So it's like things that can be used in speech, often used in speech that is like a transformative therapy was the example that came in the context, but we also have the context of the constellation work that Matthew and Jacob in the portal were talking about in association with the trauma that we carry in the body from World War II is what they were really emphasizing from, or the World Wars. So you put people in this like a constellated group setting, and the speech that comes out is often very simple, but like very, very potent. Like to have a stranger who's maybe occupying the position of, sometimes it's just that your family that's constellated, your mother, and then the stranger says like, I see you, or I saw you carrying, I saw you carrying that. Like it can be deeply transformative for that person. They might even experience something like a hook being coming out of their flesh. Like immediately in this space, it's an impossible kind of languaging that gets that accumulates. The one of the dangers, or that I'm trying to think that this conversation is really helping me with, is that people who really get into those processes, they tend to take the efficacy of the transformational language, the non-rational language, and they treat it as an explanation, or like they treat it as the account of what's really happening. So then like a worldview solidifies around the voice that comes out as a transformational moment, and then these pockets of worldviews like proliferate. And I think what I'm trying to think is why that could down the line be an issue. I think it might set up certain expectations in the agent or in the subject, or who's using speech in that way, and it can be crazy making, because the more you use that speech, the more you induce transformative process in people. So this area, I'm not too sure how to think of it conclusively, but I just noticed this this like falling into the sense that yeah, there's power there for explanation. And then just on this just the last point on this fuck you, the one who says fuck you, and then noticing that like that, well, sex, like fuck you, and then like I want to fuck you, like that, the what that does to our self-sense. And this is exactly the energy that moves that transformative embodied process, and it plays with that hard to mediate, hard to be with sexual energy. Let me put it there. I'm really grateful for this thread of conversation, because it's helping me see what I constantly encounter online, Instagram, friends, and like these worldviews that circle around deeply transformative practice. And there's a necessity for it. There's a necessity for that work in one's own body. But then I'm trying to maybe maybe you guys can help me. You guys and lady can help me. Why? Like how to respond to that?
No, magnificent. We appreciate you being here. There's every single transformative activity, the moment you do it, you can think about it. And the moment you think about it, you can create it into a worldview. And the moment you create it into a worldview, it can be an internally consistent system that creates in and out. And there now we have a map, right? Now, maps are inevitable. Humans are going to form maps. The problem today is maps. So, like, if I were to talk about Jordan Peterson, okay? And, so Jordan Peterson's idea, and this is critical, and we talked about it last week, is that people are willing to blow up the world for their maps, okay? Like, that's how big maps are. And a way to look at this, because he's concerned about the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'm obsessed with the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't think we think about that enough. That thing's freaking nuts. We're literally willing to kill everything to destroy the world. The only way you can make sense of that is if you understand that people's maps are their world. So the choice is between destroying the world and destroying the world. Well, then it's a coin flip, right? Like, that's how deep maps are, okay? So the problem is, what Peterson understands, so he says, well, if we don't have maps, which are conflated in his work with mythology, then subjectivity breaks down. You have no way to have the hero versus the dragon, okay? All right? He's right. Without maps, we go nuts. But guess what? Maps have their own problems. There are points in which maps turn the hero becomes a dragon in maps. And you know when that is? When two maps conflict with one another. When people are doing transformative experiences and they run into the geopolitical realist, conservative, and they can't have a conversation. And you know what ends up happening? They get frustrated and they're like, well, if that guy just did body work, then he would understand why we shouldn't be at war in the Middle East. And the people who are at war in the Middle East are like, these idiots doing body work have no idea about geopolitical realism, right? So the problem is that transformative activities have to be done more than talked about, and they have to be avoided from. Most people want to rationally justify the transformative activity. Well, once you do that, then you're creating a map, right? What's really hard about truly transformative activity is that you have to be naked with them as an absolute choice. Because if you try to explain the benefits or you try to make them rational, well, then you're making a worldview that then creates the ever proliferation of maps and worldviews, and now you're just making the pluralism worse, right? Also, another thing we could say is that transformation in a world that conflates the good and the beautiful is not going to actually deal with the problem of pluralism. You're just going to have people transformed by their goods, but not able to relate. They'll relate well with other people that have transformed, but they won't have the beauty of which transcends those different maps by which to bring things together. We basically never dealt with the problem of the many and the one. And transformative activities may make you more of a one. It may make people who do them more of a one. But if you don't base those transformative, the question is this, and then I'll give it to Christian and Javier. What is the end of the transformative activities? Is it for you to come to terms with yourself or to handle relationships, surprise of the man on the side of the road, as Ivan Illich will say with the Good Samaritan, the surprise with the pluralistic other, the surprise with the person that says F you. If you're doing transformative activity in order to say love yourself, which of course is important, but not in a manner that makes you able to handle the experience of the guy that says F you without you exiting, then the transformative activity is actually only making the problem of maps worse. It is making the problem of fragmentation worse. But it's alternative. It seems alternative to the logic of capital, and that's good. But the problem is there are many ways to end up in fragmented maps, not just in the logic of the economy, right? And so this is where the betweenness is a very, very big activity. But at the same time, if you then on the rationalist side say, well, the transformative stuff is stupid, we don't need that, well, now you're in autonomous rationality. But if you're on the transformative side, and it is not for the sake of the encounter, the surprise of difference, the shock of difference and beauty, the transformativeness can actually just create more siloing and a failure of interaction. But this gets into where the emphasis on theme and story is also very helpful as Luber. But I'll stop and give it to Christian, then Mr. Rivera. Christian, thank you for being here, sir.
Lots of interesting stuff here. Yeah, it's a question. This question of how might you invite someone into encountering philosophy or betweening or these kinds of things. It's something I think about a lot. Though I can grow, maybe someone can dissuade me from my pessimism here, but I have like a increasingly limited aspiration that you can do a whole lot of this inviting of people into philosophy. I mean, you might, I don't know, I guess you'd put LSD in the water supply or something. Like there's not like like scalable ways to do this that I see being very available to us. Traditionally, it's things like religion and like cultural norms that take, I think, a lot of time to build up. Okay, well, two things. One thing I think about is just how can we create, well, I don't know. I get so hesitant here to even like think in terms of creative solutions because it's a very fraught enterprise to try to like change the minds of people. It could go so poorly. But the one thing I rites of passage as a opportunity for people as they come of age, so to speak, to encounter fear directly and find it with themselves. Man, my connection sucks. Okay, I need to find a deeper connection with you guys on my internet provider. So, well, here's like the gist that I find interesting. It's like there are certain indigenous communities where you're not really considered an adult member of the tribe until you have gone through your rites of passage. You've gone on your vision quest or whatever it might be. There's like interesting rites of passage in Africa where the young men, there are traditions for the women as well. They keep them separated by gender, but I know with the men at least, they have to go through a whole week, I think, of trials and tribulations, including spending the night buried in the ground up to their necks, and then just having the insects crawl over their faces all night and shit like this. And it makes sense to me that it's going to be harder to trust people who have not gone through some shit where they've been able to experience that they can survive really difficult, scary stuff. Because if you haven't gone through that, then you're more likely to have your like ethics or morality or whatever kind of compromised by your fears. Are you willing to love others as yourself? Are you willing to be, you know, an integral member of your community if the consequences of quote unquote doing what's right is just induces too much fear? Well, you know, it can make sense that going through scary experiences helps to relieve the fear here. And you'd be like, no, no, tough for me. Um, and this is a sacrifice or, you know, there's some amount of pain I'll have to endure, but it's the right thing to do. And I know I can survive this pain. I think that alone, you know, is going to give someone so much more leverage to encounter philosophy, to be willing to confront difference. Because I mean, why are we afraid of that in the first place, right? Doesn't it come down to these primal evolutionary drives that were spoken to earlier? We're afraid of the other. We're afraid of getting kicked out of our own, right? We don't want to, like, if your conscience tells you that what everyone else in your group is doing is wrong, um, and the price you might have to pay for being outspoken about it is that you get kicked out. That's like one of the hardest things there is to deal with, right? To want to be alone or whatever. And it probably triggers a sense of possible death, right? Because of the evolutionary aspect of this. If I get excluded from the group, it's pretty hard to survive. Um, so I just imagine it's going to be really hard to like get people to encounter philosophy and the terror of the unknown that exists when you disagree with others, right? Unless you have like some kind of somatic resilience that comes through actually physiologically living through tough things that, you know, really test your nervous system, your ability to remain psychologically grounded through these types of experiences. Um, so that's really only like one piece of probably a much greater puzzle, of course, but it's something I think about all the time. But what do you do? I mean, it, it's not something you can, I think today at least, institute, right? It's too wacky. We could bury everyone up to their neck. It's you don't get to vote maybe until you've been buried up to your neck. I don't know. Maybe but no, like yeah, of course, our lawmakers are not going to pass the buried up to your neck law. Um, but so like what can we actually do? I have no idea really, but where I find a little bit of room for like uh, not defined, but just a kind of like vague space of aspiration and hope is in the um it's really like in the problems that we're facing. The it's again, I can't really like paint a picture here. It's more of an abstract argument that just says something like, as you know, chaos and uncertainty and strife and all of these things kind of keep increasing, um, and then add into the mix the like you know incredible uh, that's the power of technology being anything from like AI to the ability to connect with people over the internet, et cetera, to move information around quickly. You know, there's a lot of potential for people to be willing to kind of try whatever because the alternative seems like certain doom, right? So but that could go so many different ways. Like it's not like, oh, whenever there's an emergency, we all just magically start doing smart shit. Or like it might make us it might kind of bring out our courage a bit, right? When we start to get a sense that we have to break with our normativity, our norms. But that courage doesn't necessarily mean we have wisdom, right? To act in a way that's going to effectively help us find lasting and useful solutions. But yeah, I guess I'll stump for the courage side of it for now, at least. How do we help people get more access to courage and not simply resort also to the anti-phobic response? And I've talked with you about this before, Daniel, anti-phobia, and I just realized there's like a really good example of anti-phobia, which is in a cheesy good guy, bad guy movie where the villain has henchmen, and it's the scene where the hero is approaching the villain. The villain wants to send his henchmen out before letting himself go into the fight, right? And the henchman is some, lousy guy with no real courage, and he's afraid to go fight the hero because the hero's big and bad and strong, but he's also afraid to face the wrath of the villain. So he's like caught, and you just see this scene. At least I'm imagining it, and I believe I've seen it multiple times, where the henchman's like, okay, and then what do? They just like kind of like yell really loud in like a kind of barbarian craze and just rush into the at the hero, where it's not courage, it's not even really bravery, so to speak. It's anti-phobic behavior where like they are like kind of checking out from the experience. They're just like, I can't be here for this. I'm so fucking scared. And I'm the donkey, right? But instead of stuck between two grass, I'm like stuck between two lions. And I don't know which way to run. And I run towards this lion, but I'm checked out. And of course they get sliced down immediately because they have no wits about them, right? They are not present. They're just kind of in a blind panic, so to speak. And I think the potential for anti-phobic response to big problems en masse at scale is pretty high, which is a little terrifying. Like what happens when like entire groups of people, populations kind of have an anti-phobic response to increasing whatever kinds of tensions or threats that they perceive in the world around them. I don't know. We'll see, but maybe we can figure out a little bit of a better, I don't know, escape from that pathway.
I hope so. And also, anti-phobic is an extremely useful construct. I very much appreciate you bringing it to the picture because a lot of what looks like courage is just anti-phobia. And I think you're right. I think a lot of people under anxiety, complexity, global pluralism, what you see are anti-phobic responses that look brave and it looks like, you're facing fear, but really you're just amassing under a strong man or you're really just kind of rushing in by turning off your brain. It looks brave, but it actually is the lack of bravery. I think the anti-phobic is very, very useful. You said it once that was very important. I think facing fear is at the heart of this problem. I think it is not by chance that many of the people I find to be remarkable conversationalists were also athletes, are athletes. They were in the military, they're in the war. They have some sort of background where they have done some things. I also think it's interesting in classical education. If I'm thinking the Republic, book 7, it's like, hey, when kids are young, make sure you make them like do gymnasium before you do books. Don't be introducing books to them before they're like 12 or whatever. They'll hate them. So there has to be some sort of training, dare I say, of the nervous system that, say, having your wrestling coach force you to run up bleachers for a long time can help with or something like that, right? I think this is very astute. I think that inability to face fear, well, so if I were to say what I think basically would go a very long way to making the average person philosophical, one would have to be a means that doesn't tell them they're becoming philosophical. It can't just be like, hey, we're going to make everyone philosophical. That doesn't work. The question is, what is the spirit of philosophical that one is spreading? I think part of it is not, I think most people are afraid of questions. You ask a question, they get nervous. If I ask you a question, what did you do today? I have to prove myself. I was productive. Like, questions are terrifying. I think also they're terrifying because basically in the school system, you learn that when you're asked a question, there is a right answer. And if you don't know it, you're in the wrong. So we develop a subconscious association with questions as being scary and running from and nervous. And one of the ways we deal with our anti-phobia, the anti-phobic response to questions tends to be small talk. We create certain social scripts. You ask me questions about my day, I ask you, oh, okay, it looks like you're not afraid of questions, but actually it's anti-phobia. It's not actually the courage of questions. One of the reasons this occurs is because of the school as a medium condition that trains you to associate questions with trivia. There is a right answer, there is a wrong answer, so you become afraid of it, and also an educated person is good at tests. This is one of the reasons I continue constantly to emphasize that basically education needs to be in the medium of conversation, is so that people do not create the subconscious association of questions as scary and running from them. In fact, asking questions and exploring is simply what one does when you are with other people. If average people had that subconscious association with questioning as just what one does when you're with people, and it's not that there are right and wrong answers, it's exploring, that would go an incredible long way to making people philosophical without making them directly philosophical, because you remove that fear of questions. And I mean, certainly one of the reasons why we homeschool is so our children do not indirectly create an association of questions as scary, or you shouldn't be asking that, but actually it's fun. What else do you talk about except follow a thread? Like, whenever we say, oh, following a thread, what is following a thread other than following questions? And not even think, here's the other thing, like in philosophy, you even kind of forget you're asking questions. It just seems like the next step. Oh, well, this would be the next thing. And you make points, and the questions are tied to points. It's more like walking, really, right? And you're following a resonance. You're following an alter. You're following a thing, right? That, if you remove the subconscious fear of questions, actually have questions be tied to exploration, which is engaging. And also, I think it's geopathic and creates energy. And then people in their friendships naturally do that. Well, now we are creating a culture that is going to be able to, the surprise of difference. Because when you're in a philosophical discussion, you're hearing ideas you never heard before, you're saying things you never thought before, but it's live. You're able to do that because you could say your nervous system is in a place where you're not nervous and crazy the entire time, right? So I would be of the opinion that if you can basically remove the average person's subconscious association with questions being scary, and conversation with friends shouldn't be philosophical. In fact, it's just what one does. You follow what's interesting and you talk about it with people because you can't share things otherwise and figure out things for yourself otherwise. That would go a long way, I think. But it is tied to fear.
You're talking about questions and the turn my video off. The fear of questions because of conditioning from the education system, where we're taught that every question is supposed to have an answer. And of course, if you don't know the answer, you're dumb. And also the answer is like in the back of the book, or, you know, it's whatever. I'm working on an essay right now about the psychology of theories of consciousness, and this exact train of thought plays into it a bit, which is like, you know, I'm basically trying to analyze why people take certain paths of reasoning in their arguments for different theories of consciousness, whether that's panpsychism or idealism or materialism or whatever. I find it fascinating, like where people's thinking goes, and I've just been trying to build a little bit of a theory of like why if we're given all the same information, you have people who are let's say at comparable levels of intelligence, why does one person go this way, the other one goes that way? And of course there's too many variables to ever, like, I'd say, claim a complete understanding here. But I do think there are some general things that we can think about, and I think one of them is just this: the fear of uncertainty and of not having answers to questions, perhaps a bit of like an OCD If I'm probably like stretching this a little bit, but it's what I call like completionist mindset, where when I was a kid, like when I played video games, I wanted to like make sure I got every little thing that you could do in a game done, right? Like every little side quest. This was back before games you took like 80 hours to do every single thing in them. Um, and my friend told me, "Oh, you're a completionist." I remember back in high school or something, or middle school. Um, and I think sometimes we are like this with our our theories, right? If there's a question, there's the fear that there is an answer that you don't have. Like there's an answer to this question. I don't know what it is. Um, the stakes can be so high, especially if it's a really deep question about consciousness or meaning or something, whatever, transcendent or transpersonal or metaphysical, or super fundamental to our models, which if you had the answer might deeply inform your whole model of reality, right? Uh, I think it's become so sticky in our minds, um, and it becomes so hard to turn away from the question, even if there's like pretty good arguments that the question itself is flawed, that it doesn't really make sense, or that the answers that you're gravitating towards don't really make sense. I uh, I think it's too hard. It's too sticky. There's and then the more time you spend on it, there's sunk cost, right? Um, there's a feeling that we might be so close. We've done so much work. It's just right. It's just maybe around the corner here. Um, but I do think a lot of that does come back from early education and just this feeling like, if you can ask a question, you can somehow at some point eventually find an answer. And this is, yeah, there's no space for, well, people have a hard time being comfortable with like the idea of a question mark just hanging there. Anyway, could go on and on about it. Sorry, Javier, I took your spot, but welcome back. I hope your audio is working now.
I hope so as well. I'll give it to Rivera and we'll
Can you hear me?
see. Yes, we can. Look, it's there. And I'm just going to say, I think what you're saying on the completionist is extremely powerful and true. And I think we have a society of completionists. That's why we get internally consistent systems like maps. And basically, people are like, why even do philosophy? You don't know the end. And here's the issue. It basically, completionism means you can't have drive, only desire, then intrinsic motivation is lost. Also, as Blondel teaches us, what we complete, we stop caring about because we finished it, so we're done. So a completionist mindset actually sets us up for boredom, to not have drive, to end up only doing things that are intelligible to other people, which means it can be captured by the algorithm, and ultimately to end up not engaging in something continual, which I think basically human beings die if they don't have something continual. I think the geopedic is continual. I think philosophy invites the continual. And I think we are indeed in a society that moralizes completeness, and therefore you should only ask questions that have answers. And so, why are you wasting your? We basically, if you can't complete it, you're wasting your time. When, ironically, the only way to have drive, and I would say the fullness of the human being, is to therefore do something that's wasting your time, the non-rational, the leisure, etc., so forth. And if we don't do that, we're screwed. But Mr. Rivera, we did hear you. Feel free, my friend.
Yes. Man, this conversation was like so pertinent, which was like why it sucked the Zoom try to jit me. Anyways, so I've been reading Aristotle, as all of you know. I'm on that Aristotle train with Jockin now. And there's something that Sarah Brody, she's a commenter on the book I'm reading with Aristotle, Ethics with Aristotle. And I thought it was so interesting that the reason why I think it's pertinent to this topic is that for the longest time, we seem to have this inclination that reason cannot do any harm per se. And that's created a very interesting relationship to our pathos. So this pathos includes our affections, our emotions, um, basically anything that is not reasoning. It's not anything that cannot be articulated. And what's interesting about Sarah Brody going through this is that Aristotle says that pathos has this very specific relationship with the soul, which is that it can listen to reason. It's amenable to reason. But because it's amenable to reason, isn't that all the clues that we need to understand that actually reason itself can abuse pathos? But, and this is where therapy and virtue gets very interesting, because I've been thinking about this. Jockin knows I've been thinking about this a lot, which is to say that just because logos abuses pathos does not mean that virtue is not possible. Because what Aristotle's saying when he talks about the orthos logos, right, the sort of right reason, I don't think we actually know what that means. I have no idea what that means. What does right reason mean? Now, of course, he's coming from a syllogistic point of view, so there's a sense in which we could probably point out right reasoning. But what's interesting about that is Aristotle does not really talk about the idea that logos could abuse pathos. And that's where I think the psychoanalytic train jumps up, right? Why is psychoanalysis always talking about a kind of relaxation of the logos, right? Free associate. Let your impulses speak. What's very interesting about logos is that logos has a false authority. Logos can only articulate. Christian just made like a wonderful example of like, well, we can't really like reason our way to like telling people that they should do philosophy, right? Logos can only articulate. But it's because logos can articulate that it creates a kind of authoritative relationship by virtue, because the pathos itself cannot articulate itself. It can only listen to reason. It's only amenable to reason. So it seems that this is why the body is a very interesting thing, because the body, going into the body means that one can have a relaxed logos. And if one can have a relaxed logos, then one can actually attempt to feel, witness, experience their actual pathos without the critique of reason, the the kind of abusive relationship that logos has to pathos. Now, there's a sense in which I think the religious framework has something right about pathos, but because we're reading Al-Ghazali right now, and all the metaphors that Al-Ghazali used were kind of master authority kind of relationships, right? Like have control over the appetites, have a kind of relationship with the appetites. There's never, I have not seen Al-Ghazali use a metaphor of the king as reason abusing the appetites, which is what I think psychoanalysis is very obsessed with. That actually they're obsessed with the fact that logos can abuse pathos. But I also think this doesn't negate the fact that virtue is possible. It just means that we actually don't know what right logos actually means. And then also, to be fair to Aristotle, when he's talking about to be harmonious with the soul, as Sarah Brody argues, is that actually you wouldn't be able to actually delineate between the two, between your pathos and logos, when they are in harmony together. So what it means to be virtuous then is when our logos and our pathos have reached some type of harmony together. And it seems like whatever framework that we have to work on, because I think even the proposal that Christian proposed, I think that might be more like a pathos kind of a relationship, right? Bury me in the sand, expose me to my pathos. But then there's this other framing of, well, what does right logos mean? Because the only answer that we've given is that we have to take a break from logos. That's the only answer we've given. We have to give a break from logos. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Magnificent. So I think first, this idea that reason can't do harm. I think this is critical. It was the dream of the Enlightenment. Therefore, if we can increase reason, we'll get rid of war. And actually, it gave totalization, right? Let's take the phenomenological journey Cadell talks about in Real Speculations. So you have reason, you have spirit, you have religion, and you have absolute knowing. All right, so reason we could say is where you go, well, rationality, I'll just say rationality, using them interchangeably. Rationality can do no harm. All right, but then you get to the place where you go, well, actually it can. So spirit can't do any harm. Well, spirit is non-rationality. And actually, no, non-rationality can do harm, just like Daniel Coughlan was bringing up. You can have these transformative experiences that create cults, or they become these fragmented structures that actually create us versus them, because you don't do the body work we do. We're enlightened, you're not, so you can get those problems. So then you go, religion can't do any harm, which is where we may set Jordan Peterson, mythology, and we could say the non-rational with the non in parentheses. Rational, as I was talking about, can't do any harm. No, it actually can. Just because you have a map in a mythology, if you can't handle otherness, you can just use non-rationality with the non in parentheses actually to create World War III just as well, actually. And you might actually be really good. Actually, that's where, unfortunately, non-rationality with the non in parentheses, or let me just say speculative reason. Speculative reason actually is where beauty, if you have the onto-epistemology of beauty, then it can invert into the worst of all possible things. So the problem in religion, where Peterson is set, is that without that lack is not nothing at absolute knowing, well, then it can be the worst of things, right? And also, even in absolute knowing, there can always be the inversion that we've talked about before, right? So here's the key. There is no point when you can escape the possibility of harm. Crap. Oh, crap. There's no possibility when you can escape the possibility of harm? No. So by definition, there's no algorithm. Like, if you have an algorithm, there will be harm. And yet you'll do it because you think there isn't harm. So we have to get rid of thinking there's any possibility of no harm. Everything can harm. Pathos, logos, body, relationships. There's plenty of harm for everyone. But that's also why there's beauty everywhere. If there is the possibility of beauty, there's the possibility of danger. Everything can be beautiful, everything can be dangerous. But this is also why it can be meaningful. This is also why it can be motivational. This is why it can be powerful. Because there is risk. If there was any calibration or ordering of reality that could remove risk, it would be hell. Because it would be empty, right? The very presence of risk is precisely where you get glory and virtue, right? Virtue and risk have to go together in very profound ways. But that idea that reason can't do harm, I basically think every level of that phenomenological journey, there's an assumption of what can't do harm. Well, if we were spiritual and not religious, that couldn't do harm, right? That was the idea. No, that can create all sorts of harm and manipulation and cults and all sorts of crazy libidinal stuff. Well, if everyone was reasonable, it can't create harm. No. That gives us totalitarianism, nihilism, meaning crises, etc., so forth. Well, if everyone was religious in the Jordan Peterson sense, then it would not do harm. Oh no, it absolutely could. It can revert to the logic of capital, classical conservatism, when we get all sorts of problems, right? So the question is, how do we hold a space that has the possibility of harm without it blowing up? Well, that's holding the geopetic. It requires virtue. Okay, well then what is virtue? All right. Well, there's something about virtue that is relaxed logo. I like what you said about a certain relaxed logos. This is very, very good. Because I will put it how I think about it. And then I'll give it to Mr. Luber. And if anyone has any final thoughts, please. And we talked about this with Aspasia and Seth. So when I go back to that thinking, perceiving distinction, when I realized I can perceive my hand and not think about it, and in fact, I can think about my grandmother, thus creating agency, this then was very interesting, because the question is, well, what's the relationship between perceiving and thinking, which is the relationship between pathos and logos? And pathos is non-rational, logos is rational. Pathos is body, etc., so forth. Logos is mind, and we could also say resonance to reference Jacob works, or authentic resonance to reference Aspasia, is this sweet spot between them. So the question is, what is the relation between perceiving and thinking, pathos and logos, if you grad? This is how I think about it. Basically, perception leads and thinking serves perception. Perception does not serve thinking. Thinking serves perception. Perception leads, resonance leads, body leads. Thinking is to defend the mode of perception. It is defend resonance. It is to defend it is what jumps in surprise. Because let me explain why I say this. If you say, wait a minute, are you saying that when do you think exactly? Right? Because if perception is leading, when do you engage in philosophy? One of the reasons I emphasize encounter and surprise is because when I enter into a conversation with you fine people, your very bringing up of ideas allows me to engage in thinking without choosing it. I don't have to choose to consume my perception with thinking. I am encountering that my agency is not making the choice. I am having the other bless me in a sense with experiences of thinking, right? And then afterwards, you go back to basically thinking primarily in terms that you operate in pathos, you operate in body, right? Like if you are choosing, this is where also a week or so we were talking about daydreaming and how thinking when it's at its finest feels very just kind of happening, right? It's not where you're choosing to do it. I think basically the correct relationship is this state where you find yourself thinking without choosing to think. It becomes you. It is that it becomes you. You look at a tree and you find yourself having ideas, or you encounter relationships. That sort of thinking based on the surprise. Good to see you, Javier. Based on the surprise allows for thinking to serve perception without you becoming thoughtless. But of course, for thinking to serve perception, that's going to require virtue, because how do you perceive well? And that's also going to mean you do the work of the body. You have the nervous system to handle surprise, etc. Luber, good to see you. Thinking serves perception. Logos serves pathos. And you have, when you do that, a certain relaxed disposition. Like resonance is more from a relaxed state. You just find yourself thinking. You don't go, I'm going to study philosophy. The problem is if you do that, here's the reason why I also say that. When thinking serves perception, thinking is not egoic. And you don't overly identify with thinking because I'm choosing to think this. This is me, or I'm choosing to study philosophy. Then it is you. You want to primarily identify and be the pathos, the body, the perception. Like you primarily want to be that. And one of the reasons is because it's a state that is more of it's not where you're anti-thinking, but you're more experiential. If you mostly identify with that, then you deal with the ego. It's not that you make a point to kill the ego, you just forget about it because you are habituating yourself primarily to being in the body or experiencing the world or, actually having the experiences. Like then the ego the ego enables perception, but since it's not the ego is not primarily making choices to think, then the ego actually does not become egoic. It actually becomes just the operating principle of the body that you forget about. And so that helps you not overly identify with the ego or become egoic. Like if you make intentional strategies of killing the ego or detaching from the ego or et cetera, so forth, this may not accomplish that. But actually, if you simply increase your capacity for experience or perception and make that primary and let the thinking come when it comes, as stimulated by the environment, then thinking is not something you are primarily choosing. Instead, you are choosing to be, and thus to habituate yourself to the possibility of resonance. And here's the key. If you develop resonance, as Jacob talks about, well, then your thinking serves your resonance. And this is a very important thing. When your thinking and philosophy serve your resonance, well, then your thinking is honoring it, chiseling it, forming it, learning how to share it, and then it goes away and lets the resonance lead. And then when you feel, then it comes in and it tries to explain, then it goes away. So to say perception is primary is to say resonance is primary, and then thinking serves out, which resonance we can align with theme in Luber, and following the resonance actually is how you have the story, but thinking has to follow that. And then also, basically the stuff you choose, like why do you choose to study Hegel? Because there's a resonance. You let the thinkers you study be the books that sing to you. Like what in the world around you is singing to you. That is what your thoughts should serve. And when you do that, your experience of your thinking feels like not something you're choosing, but something that's chosen. And if your thinking feels like something you are choosing and doing, then it will become malformed. The thinking that you experience has to feel somewhat other to you. It has to feel as if it is not just what you want to think, but what you find yourself thinking. There's a difference between saying, I'm thinking about Hegel because I want to study Hegel, and saying, I find myself thinking about Hegel. There's a radical difference here. Because actually, when you find yourself thinking something, that means you're trusting your body, actually, and what it is resonating with, and letting yourself go with what you're thinking about. You're not making a point to shut it down or to turn it off. You say, no, I find this is what I am going through, and so that is what I will think. So to me, the only way to deal with the problems that Mr. Rivera is talking about is for thinking to serve perception. Logos has to serve pathos. But then here's the thing. If you're going to have pathos lead, then you're going to have to deal with those traumas. You're going to have to deal with your body. You're going to have to deal with libido. You're going to have to deal with emotions. Pathos, you can't just do that. You can't just say, okay, great, let's let logos serve pathos. You have to go into the pain, right? You have to go through the healing. And like we're saying, there's generational trauma, et cetera, so forth, right? So you can't have a proper relation between pathos and logos without the work, like Jacob is doing, and we have been mentioning today, and I think beauty is strongly tied to that. And then if you don't have anywhere in society go to do that work, well then logos is like, here's the other key. Logos naturally conceals pathos. Because the moment you think about it, you translate it into logical terms. So it doesn't seem like you need body work. Because the moment you think about body work, you think about it logically, so I don't need body work. So here's the problem. If you think about pathos, it vanishes pathos. The act of thinking about pathos conceals it, right? And if you simply don't have schools, educations, or families that go, hey, you're concealing yourself from what you need, why would you ever think you're concealing yourself from what you need? Because by definition, you're concealing yourself from that revelation, right? So you become self-enclosed is the term. You become self-entrapped, and then you get auto-cannibalism, right? So that is where it's really important to have places like this to talk to fine people like you, because that helps you work beyond the ways that the mind can conceal itself. I will run myself. It has been a treat. Thank you all for being here. Daniel, it's a treat. Jacob, Christian, thank you for your time. You're great.
Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel. Christian, Jacob, all the best to you, friends.